Greetings and welcome to the latest edition of the Entheogenic Evolution podcast. As always, I'm your host, Martin, and I'm happy to have you with me today. For this week's episode, Chad Charles is returning to the Entheogenic Evolution podcast. As we discuss in our conversation, it's been many years since I've had Chad on the podcast and wanted to invite him back on because he has a new research project that he's going to be telling us all about in this interview. And I'll just quickly mention it now that he has been facilitating 5-MeO-DMT for a number of years now up there in Canada and has been taking extensive notes on his sessions that he has with his clients. And he is currently looking to create, or actually has already created, a GoFundMe page to start to raise some funds so that he can go through all of this data that he has collected and, put it in order and see what's in there and then make it available to the public. So we're going to be talking all about that. I will be providing the GoFundMe link in the description for the podcast today, but you can just go to gofundme.com and it is Support Chad Charles Project. And of course, you can always find Chad online at chadcharles.net. Before we get to that, let's get a few announcements out of the way. Thanks to Brooke. Brooke, I thank you every month because you make your $10 donation through PayPal in support of the Entheogenic Evolution podcast, and you are awesome and amazing, and I appreciate that. Also, the past couple weeks over there at Patreon, a number of people have stopped by to pick up some PDF copies of my books that are available at my Patreon shop. Just want to say thank you and hope that you are enjoying the reading. Of course, if you would like to support me or support this podcast, you can join up as a supporting member over at Patreon, patreon.com/MartinWBall. Join up at the level that works for you, everywhere from $1 a month up to $100 a month. And you can change at any time. There's no obligation, and you get access bonuses and gifts as you go up the tier scale over there at Patreon. I wanted to announce that the women's retreat with 5-MeO-DMT that I have mentioned a couple times here on the podcast with Piazza is actually indefinitely delayed at the moment due to some health reasons. So I just want to let you, the listening audience, know that she's going to have to reschedule that, so that is currently out of the mix. But if you're interested, I've got something else for you here. Sarah Napick, who has been featured on the podcast previously, has some offerings that she would like me to share with you, the listening audience. So here we go. Sarah Napick is a spiritual coach and the founder of Altar of the Heart Church in Oakland, California, where she serves Bufo medicine. She is looking for 4 women to join an intimate 6-month container called Devotion, the Path to Peace, that is a combination of coaching and medicine work for real, lasting transformation. This 6-month program will help you to heal childhood trauma, your limited beliefs, and connect to God within so you can follow your heart's calling to create a life that is an authentic reflection of who you really are. She is also offering private medicine journeys with 4 weeks of support through her church in Oakland, and that is Altar of the Heart Church. She does have a website for the church that is on the way, coming soon, not currently available, but you can always reach out to her at www.sarahnapick.com. And I will also put a link for Sarah in the podcast notes, and that is SarahKnapik, sarahnapick.com. Coming up here on the Entheogenic Evolution podcast, I've got a brand new interview with Mario Garnier, who lives down in Mexico. He was the founder of the World Bufo Alvarius Congress, which met a few different times in Mexico City. I had him on my podcast years ago, and sort of Chad and Mario are kind of part of the old school of the 5-MeO-DMT world. And when I arranged the interview with Chad, I thought, I should really get an interview with Mario in. And he is now running a men's retreat called Bufo Camp in Mexico. So that's going to be the next interview here in the podcast. We're going to talk all about Mario's work and Bufo Camp. So we've got that coming. And of course, more great interviews on the way. And of course, continuing to share chapters from the audiobook for The Fate of Marani. And just a reminder that Book 3 of the Tales of Ardoin series, of which The Fate of Marani is Book 2, but Book 3, The Alchemist and the Eagle, is now available in audiobook format, as is the accompanying soundtrack that I created of all original music to go with that. And I'm happy to report that over on Spotify, it's not like I have like thousands of listeners or anything like that. But it's just nice to see that over at Spotify, the new album, The Alchemist and the Eagle, is up at 295 listens. So, hey, that's cool. I'll take it. That's what I get as a small-time musician. So, little bumps like that, I enjoy that. Let's see. I think that's all that I've got in terms of announcements for right now and for today. Oh, wait, no. I do have one more announcement. I did want to announce that the upcoming class with Mindscape Psychedelic Institute for the 5-MeO-DMT Trauma-Informed Facilitator Training course is now full. There are no more spots left in that class. That starts in April, but this is something that we are doing twice a year. So if you want to get in on that, you'll have to get in on the next round. And just to share with you, the listening audience, I am currently editing the manuscript that Stephen Kirby and I created as a manual for the class, and we are creating it as a book. And so I'm doing my book magic on it, of editing it and formatting it and putting it into book form and creating a cover for it. And we're going to be making that available to the public relatively soon. So, hey, even if you can't take the class, you can read the book. That's pretty cool, huh? Anyway, let's go ahead and get into our conversation with Chad Charles. Find him online at chadcharles.net, and links to the GoFundMe fundraiser will be available in the podcast notes. Okay, here we go. All right. I am welcoming back to the Entheogenic Evolution podcast today, Chad Charles, all the way up there in Canada. And I think it's been maybe at least 5 years since I had you on the podcast. I think it was 2020 when I had you on last, but it's been a while. So welcome back, Chad.
Oh, it has been a while, and a lot has happened in the world since we last spoke. So
Sure has.
Yeah.
Sure has. And there's a lot more happening every day.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah. So, often with return guests, we kind of skip over the, well, tell us all about yourself section. But since it's been a number of years, and, I've been doing this podcast 17 years now. And so listeners come and listeners go, and people come in and people come out. So I have no idea how many people who are listening today are people who were listening 5 years ago. So let's just kind of start with reintroducing you and what you're all about. So I'm just going to go ahead and turn it over to you, Chad.
Okay. What am I all about? Well, I think I'm here talking with you, and I'm on this podcast because I'm a 5-MeO-DMT facilitator, practitioner, provider, whatever. I'm not sure what word is best. I'm not sure what word you use anymore.
I usually use facilitator.
Yeah. Okay, great. And I think what makes my approach or offering with 5-MeO-DMT, I guess, unique to me, as it might and should be unique to every facilitator out there, is I offer it squarely in what I consider a therapy context. And so I kind of use the term therapy-assisted 5-MeO-DMT experiences. And that hasn't always been the case. I started working full-time in 2016, but it really wasn't until 2020 that I landed on a format or a structure that has been more or less consistent since then. And that is a therapy context in a private practice. And I offer that with inhalation, injection, and insufflation. Most of what I do is with inhalation, with a second place being injection, and quite seldom would I use insufflation. And I work with Jaguar, or the pure molecule. I sometimes work in groups, only if it's in a retreat format that I am participating or co-creating. But I don't do that very often. So it's something I used to do a long time ago, but not anymore. So yeah, I'm in my 10th year of full-time service. And I am now based in Toronto. I was based in Montreal prior. And yeah, maybe I'll leave it there and see what curiosity that you have or what you think would be valuable for the audience.
Sure. Well, there's a whole bunch of follow-up things that I'd like to ask you about, but maybe let's start first with this idea of therapy. And I have no idea what the legal system is in Canada, but so something that's happening now in the United States, we're bringing on board in certain limited areas, like here in Oregon, there is this psilocybin assisted program. But one of the requirements was you can't call it therapy because you're not a trained therapist, and we can't use the word therapy. And even, backing up even further, like when I wrote my 2017 book, Entheogenic Liberation, that's part of the subtitle, Unraveling the Enigma of Non-Duality with 5-MeO-DMT Energetic Therapy. So my motivation, and I'm going to get to you about your motivation, my motivation for calling it therapy at the time was, one, because I had a very specific methodology that I was using, and two, I wanted to distinguish the work that I was doing as a facilitator from the more ceremonial approach, which people that you and I both know in common have a much more ceremonial approach. And that's also become a rather burgeoning movement in the United States of entheogenic psychedelic churches. And in there, they can't call it therapy. They can't call the psychedelic medicine, which is, just a common cultural term. Everybody refers to psychedelics as medicine, regardless of the context. But within the churches, you have to call it a sacrament. You can't call it a medicine because medicine implies therapy. And in the psilocybin-assisted program, I think they have to call it the substance or the material. Like, they can't call it a medicine. And then there's the idea of having psychedelic-assisted therapy with people who are trained as therapists, and then using psychedelics in conjunction with their therapy, such as, what was going on with MAPS that got held up at the federal government level around MDMA. So anyway, this is all my roundabout way of talking about, let's talk about your use of the term therapy, and maybe if there's anything about Canadian law or culture that might have concerns around the term therapy. And just know, I'm supportive of you using the term therapy. I think it's a good idea. But yeah, let's unpack that for you and how you apply that concept with your work.
Yeah. So in Canada, those types of terminologies would be governed by the province. Right? It's a federation, just like the United States, and health is a provincial jurisdiction and authority. So from province to province, it can be vastly different. The province in which my company is based is Quebec, and they don't have jurisdiction over the word therapy, but they do have jurisdiction over the word psychotherapy. So if I use the word psychotherapy, I would be likely in trouble, so to speak, with a government authority. But therapy is kind of up for grabs. It hasn't been patented or commandeered by the government yet. And so somebody can say sound therapy when they're using their crystal bowls. And there are technical things, mostly in French. Massage therapy would be, a thing that you are certified in, and it's regulated. But the word therapy is not part of any regulation. So that aside, what I consider what you said is kind of the key word for me, and that is methodology. And so I think I apply the word therapy in what I do because there are methodologies that I use. I don't know what else to call it other than they are therapeutic methodologies. And I would say, and when it comes to therapy and distinguishing that from ceremony, I actually sometimes call my sessions ceremonies. It is therapy. It is a ceremony, right? And so I'm invoking kind of the characteristics of ceremony in the sense of there is a deep veneration of the one who is coming into this experience, right? That there is something, let's say, sacred. And the word therapy doesn't really invoke the sacredness so much, right? And so, yeah, I call them ceremonies. And I stay away from substance assisted therapy for the most part because I am not at the base, I'm not a therapist. I am a therapist, but it's not where I'm coming from.
Right.
I didn't bring 5-MeO DMT into my therapy practice. I developed a therapy practice around 5-MeO DMT experiences. And so this is how and why I've come to call it therapy assisted 5-MeO DMT experiences. I'm the what's on why people come to see me is not to have therapy. They come to see me for 5-MeO DMT experiences. And that could look like a lot of different things. But in my container, in my offering, these experiences are assisted by therapy modalities. And then I would say a part of what I consider therapy, I guess, in this context, is the degree of personalization and customization that I offer all of my clients. And so I don't have a protocol or a template, as in like, this is the process that you enter into when you arrive in my studio. It's more like I am adapting in a kind of bespoke way what I'm learning from each individual. And so it is a really deep therapeutic process that I work people with, whether or not there's a plan to just see me one time or over the years. I see clients over the years. And so I am their therapist in a sense, as well as a 5-MeO DMT facilitator. And so that's kind of how that's my perspective on therapy and how it applies to my practice.
Yeah. So let's talk about it from, let's say, a chronological perspective. So as you know, these days there are many different programs about training people to be 5-MeO guides, to be psychedelic guides in general. There's a lot of emphasis on like, get your training, get your classes. And, I'm teaching in these classes myself. So I'm not trying to like poo-poo them in any way, but I myself, when I approached facilitating, I didn't have any quote unquote training. I didn't go through a program, and kind of, I think in alignment with what you're saying is that I developed my approach through the work itself, and it became my approach. And so I hear you kind of echoing some of those things. So I'm curious for you, how did it start in terms of facilitating? Did you receive training? Like what was that got you started? And then as you developed your methodology and you developed your approach and became familiar with how you wanted to work, how did that then blossom into this idea of, okay, I'm providing a ceremony, right? Ceremony?
Yeah.
Sounds like you're talking like you're from Barcelona, a ceremony.
Right.
Yeah, a ceremony.
Yeah, it's not just my lisp. It's actually a ceremony.
A ceremony. Yes, your ceremony. So tell us a little bit about that, if you would.
Sure. I mean, to some degree, I've had a similar experience as you, and I would consider probably both of us in some sort of category of pioneering the contemporary era of 5-MeO DMT, with you having been in it a little bit longer than me, and nevertheless, even though I came a little bit later, there was still, an absence of what is available today.
Yeah.
That being said, and I do remember sharing this on the last time I was on the podcast, but how it began was in Mexico City. And it was in Mexico City that I met all of these folks, which many of them, the folks in Mexico City that put on eventually the WBAC, Mario Garnier and Hari, who you met.
Yeah.
And it was really in a kind of vague, cryptic way. I was there's a little collective, an informal collective of facilitators in there, not in Mexico, really in Mexico City, and they kind of took me under their wing, so to speak, many of them. And so I spent a lot of time with many of the folks in that little collective in Mexico City, especially Mario and Hari. So like, kudos and respect to their hand holding, to their guidance. They really took me on as an kind of an unwitting apprentice. And I say that in a way like there was nothing formal about it. I didn't even really understand that I was being apprenticed and taught and almost groomed until at some point I got it. I was like, oh, this is what's happening now. I see what you guys are doing. That's very clever. You're equipping me, you're sharing, you're transmitting to me everything that you've come to know in your own work as you've developed your practices around this experience. And so from that, I was, set off into, the world. And over the years, I began to, and this includes you, reach out to others to learn and to share and to be in a somewhat co-visible environment rather than be a lone wolf off in the corner.
Yeah.
And so in the community of practice over the years, I've learned a lot from those who I would consider peers, colleagues, and a lot of that informal sharing and knowledge has been instrumental in developing my own offering. Yeah.
First thought I want to share with you. Since we planned this interview, and I thought like, oh yeah, it's been a while since I've had Chad on. I should really have Chad on. And then I thought, you know what? It's also been a long time since I've had Mario on. So after you and I had our little exchange, I reached out to Mario and said, hey, let's get you back on the podcast because he's doing his Bufo camp in Mexico.
That's right.
And so we don't have anything set yet, but you mentioned Mario and just wanted to say, yeah, I'm kind of bringing back some of the original crew here.
Beautiful.
So one of the things you mentioned there was visibility. And I think that this is an interesting topic in the sense that first of all, you went down to Mexico and 5-MeO, DMT, and Bufo is legal in Mexico. There's no laws against it. Here in the United States, Bufo is actually doubly illegal because it contains bufotenine 5-HO DMT, which is a Schedule 1 illegal substance, and 5-MeO DMT, which also is now a Schedule 1 illegal substance. Yet up there in Canada, 5-MeO DMT is not scheduled as an illegal substance. And so I think this is also one of the interesting aspects sort of your biography is that I'm not quite sure the year it was that you launched it, but your personal website, chadcharles.net, and Breath of Five with Chad Charles, that you were one of the few people who was visible and accessible at a public level. So, oftentimes I would get emails from people saying, hey, well, where can I take 5-MeO? And I said, well, you can go see Chad. Here's Chad's website. So that was very easy for me to refer people to you. Now it's somewhat of a different landscape now, but you're still public. You're still visible. So share a little bit about that and your thoughts and ideas around actually being open and above ground. And of course, you and I, we know some people here in the United States who are still very much underground, do not want to be known, don't want their names spread around or anything like that. So that's still part of the culture here. But things are very different in Canada. So yeah,
that's true. Well, yeah, I want to follow that, but I would go back and say what I really mean by co-visible is being willing to be seen by peers. Not so much I have an outward facing persona or profile to a public, but rather can I be seen and engage with those I might consider peers, those I might consider colleagues?
Yeah.
Can I be in a place of like, I'm not a lone wolf And the only people in an unregulated field that can keep me accountable are the others who are in my field, because they know that doesn't, and I'm holding them accountable too. So there's a co-visible environment, I would say, in the unregulated field, if one chooses to be in that. Not that it's right or wrong or better or worse, but it's a choice that I've made because I have, I would say, I've been wary, not anymore so much, but in the beginning of like, oh, how is these experiences that I have personally, not just as a practitioner, although there's that too, how am I doing? Right? Like, can I see when I look in the mirror all the angles? Knowing that it's valuable to have other perspectives from peers. And so being in a co-visible environment, that is what has provided me with a lot of learning. But being visible as in public and having an outward face and profile, um, I remember when I launched my website, which I kind of sometimes I don't even know why I have a website. Not many people use it, and I don't really receive a lot of clients via my website, but it's there. And it was kind of a personal coming out. Right? It was like, oh, I'm coming. This is what I do. This is my vocation. I feel very solid and in integrous with what I do. And it took me a while to get to that place to be visible in it. I didn't have to, but it was a personal choice that had a big impact on me. Now that it's been many years, I don't know. It's not fresh. I don't have that impact. Sometimes I kind of lose sight of like, oh, right. I do have a public face. And I kind of forget about that. It's not that important to me. It's kind of been integrated. And yeah, so sometimes I'll get somebody who reaches out to me, maybe say somebody that you've referred because they're in Eastern Canada, for example. And there's like, yeah, I watched this interview with you or whatever. I'm like, oh, right. I forgot about that. Right. I forget that I'm out there.
Yeah.
It's not where I dwell, but it's out. It's when it's out, it's out. The internet doesn't forget. So there it is. It's out there. And I'm okay with it. And I would say, actually, I am at a place where I feel not only good about that, but I guess I'm ready to share more on that kind of public or visible stage. And so I've begun, as I wrote to you, I guess, some months ago, I've begun a project that might turn into a book or some sort of presentation. I don't know how it will be shared, but all of that is with the intention of sharing, and likely in a pretty public way. So I feel good about it.
Yeah, great. Well, we're going to return to that topic, but let's go back now into a little bit more of that development of the therapeutic method or style that you cultivated within your practice. And one of the things I'm kind of interested in is that process of finding your own way, finding your own style, finding your own method. Because I think that this is a question, again, there are many different training programs out there now for people working in the field of psychedelics.
I'm a part of one of them, yeah.
Yeah, and sometimes there's a sense of a student of, I've got to do it exactly how my teacher taught me. Yeah. And then I think as people develop more into their practice, then it becomes more of, well, what's really authentic to me, and how do I find that, and how do I express that? So that's what I'm interested in hearing from you, is how you went through that process of discovery, and having worked with Hari and Mario, and then developing it into your own and making it your own. And even we can perhaps even discuss these issue of working with toad secretions with bufo versus working with the pure molecule, because even that's an issue that comes up with people, because a lot of people do go to Mexico to train, and they're all trained in bufo down there. But certainly in the United States today, the overwhelming consensus seems to be shifting towards work with the pure molecule and leave the toads alone. Now, that's not 100% anyway, but it's definitely a very strong emphasis these
Yeah.
days.
Yeah.
So wherever you'd like to jump in on those
Sure.
collection of topics.
Sure. Oh, yeah. Yeah. What comes to mind actually is the personal process that I went into when I started to mentor other facilitators. And when I started to do that, I really did a deep dive into what is mentorship? What is training? How does a mentorship and a training differ? What's the difference between a mentorship and an apprenticeship? And what I learned in that process, and it's very much echoed or mirrored in this document. I can't remember what it's called that the conclave put out. Something about guidance relationships. So this idea that there's this umbrella, and there's apprenticeships, and there's mentorships, and there's trainings. And so the way that it goes about it, a training is there's a program, there's a curriculum, there are teachers, there are students, and there is a training somebody to work in a particular way that is espoused by that training. So there's a protocol, typically. There's a way that we do things. And then a mentorship is something a little more loose, let's say, where, at least in the way that I apply myself as a mentor, I'm supporting people in finding their way. I'm really a proponent of people finding their authentic way of bringing that forth with the idea that there is no one way. There's probably a large net that we might call best practices, and there are ethical codes and commitments and whatever. But there is a way that can be developed, and I'll go into that in my personal process too. And then there's apprenticeships, and I lament at how few and how rare an apprenticeship is. And when I think of what a true apprenticeship is somebody who's likely a master, so like a master practitioner, a master facilitator, whatever that means. Are they declaring themselves that, or who makes them a master? I don't know. I'm not going to get into that, but they're going to take somebody on, their apprentice, and share with them what they do, how they do it, and why they do it, so that that apprentice can go forward and apply themselves in the way that they have been apprenticed. It's not a training, but it's closer in resemblance, that they're probably going to follow in the footsteps. This is the stuff of traditions. This is the stuff of lineages, in a sense, right? It's following through. So in my way, the way that I developed, I didn't have a master that I was apprenticing. I would say at the very onset, I kind of had a loose, informal mentorship in Mexico City, but that was short-lived. And I had a lot of learning and a lot of growing to do. And so I guess I just took it, and there were no trainings that there are now. And so I took it upon myself to create what I call like my self-designed practicum. And I spent years, and still do, developing my toolbox and equipping myself with different methodologies that seem to fit with how I authentically hold this experience for myself and for others. And so I didn't have kind of a formal guidance. I wish I did. I wish there was somebody that maybe I had reached out to, or somebody that it was obvious that this is what they had to offer, but I didn't. That's now what I'm doing for others, but it wasn't really available.
No.
And so developing my toolbox was part, this is what interests me because it's me. And it's also part, this is my experience with 5-MeO-DMT. This is my experience with myself in that medicine, in that substance, in those. And so how can what tools can I put in my toolbox that are not there because somebody told me I should put them in my toolbox, but they're there because they speak to me directly. And so I find them to be authentic and coherent with who I am.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So then in developing your own authentic practice, so tell us a little bit more about what that is, as with this description of the therapy, the ceremony, and we'll get to this question, but maybe this will be part of your answer as well, but also with the different routes of administration and how that might apply differently for different therapeutic purposes or different goals.
Yep. Yeah. Well, so what a session looks like with me, let's say, is that however first contact has been made, maybe you referred somebody to my website and they wrote in my contact form or what have you. And typically I send people a landing page. It has a password to it, so they'd have to have the password. They can't just find it online. Yeah. And it's usually, say if they're in Toronto, it has my calendar for my availabilities. And I just tell people on that landing page about me, how I hold this experience, who is this for, so to speak, kind of like painting a picture. Like, this is what you're looking at and getting yourself into if this is your first time. If I'm working with clients over time, they probably never see that page again because they already know.
Right.
And then they find themselves a place in my calendar. They register for a session. They fill out an intake form. We schedule a pre-session call. We usually have one. There may be more. Everything is very custom according to what really needs to happen here.
Yeah.
And in that pre-session call, we're going over the intake form, getting to know each other, really finding some resonance, creating that therapeutic alliance, if you will. And then if we have a yes, right, there's a yes for this person to work with me because it feels like there is resonance. If there's a yes for me to work with them, then we go ahead with the session. A session typically is anywhere between 2.5, 3.5 hours. It's rarely shorter than that, oftentimes longer than that. It's flexible because it's not a cookie cutter event where we know what's going to happen and we're watching the clock. So there's flexibility there. And without going into the details of the session just yet, it follows up with a post-session call where we are kind of wrapping up, closing the container with some forward movement. And how I look at it, and I guess this is a part of my therapy approach, is what I can offer somebody as a guide is connecting the dots between what they're bringing, whether that be their intention or just like where they're at in life, what life has dealt them and how they've been playing with their cards. And then comes the session. And in these experiences, it's utterly unpredictable. We don't know what is going to be experienced. And so there is a primacy of attention. We're bringing attention to the emergent material, not clinging to what has been spoken to before the session.
Right.
And then there's the time after the session. Well, things fall into place. All the snowflakes in the snow globe fall into a new pattern, etc. And then we have our first follow-up call that is an attempt to how can we weave, how can we make sense of what has been brought forth, what actually occurred, what's been happening since. And generally, that kind of points us either in a direction for that person to go down, or it's a zooming out and all of those dots that connect create, a larger picture for them to grasp. Which will give them something to work with and moving forward, whether moving forward with me, continually with follow-up calls, and we have like an ongoing therapy relationship, or, well, off they go in the world. I would say that when I open my schedule, about About 2/3 of my slots are taken by people who have already had sessions with me. So I continue to work with people. I wouldn't say regularly. It's not necessarily like clockwork. Every 3 months, this is what we're going to do. But it moves forward at whatever pace that makes sense for them. Yeah. So that's an overall picture of a flow with me, whether it's somebody's first time or it's somebody's 10th time.
Yeah. And that point that you make about having returning clients, that for me, that was an important part of how I was characterizing my own work as quote unquote therapy, in the sense that sometimes in ceremony, the approach is like, here, have your experience, and then go away, go lead your life, and maybe you come back again or maybe not. But the idea of therapy for me also centers more around this idea of that it's not about singular experiences, but it's actually about how the thread ties from one to the next and what the progression is, and that it is a transformative process, and it's not something that is accomplished in one session. So just in the same way that when we go to other forms of therapy, that usually means we're going repeatedly to whatever that modality is in order to affect change and transformation over time, that we can work with psychedelics in the same way. And therefore it's therapeutic. And it's different than going and worshiping or just receiving communion, which is great. I'm not bashing that in any way. But it's very different. Like, sometimes I compare the whole therapeutic approach to how when I used to attend the Santo Daime church, or going to the Native American church and eating peyote and drinking ayahuasca and doing those things, that it wasn't the same process of let's do an intake, let's find out what's going on with you, what you're looking for. There's no follow-up checkup afterwards. And yes, you can keep going to the church, but it's not within this context. It's much more private in some respects, that it's like your experience is your experience, but today we're having a prayer meeting about this, so you can come participate in that. But it's not looked at in that same therapeutic sense, even though people still do get therapeutic results from it. But I think the word itself signals somewhat of a different orientation around how we're approaching it and how we're looking at potentially integrating that into life outside of the session itself.
I agree with that. And I think that is something that those of us who choose to use the word therapy, we are upholding some sort of definition or potential of what that could look like. But we could use that word and water it down and dilute it to no end. And that is also done. And so it's still, despite that nod in that direction of the potential, what you just described, and I would say like my own flow of my private practice, it's still incumbent on the individual to take responsibility for themselves in an unregulated field where there are no standards, where anybody could just say the word therapy.
Right.
You still have to investigate, take responsibility for yourself as a prospective participant, if it's your first time or you're meeting a new facilitator, to understand what is it that they're offering, what are they bringing to the table, and is it a good fit for you, what you want, and where you're at in your life.
Absolutely. We didn't get to this question, so I'm going to return to it. I almost forgot about it, but then I remembered. So we're coming back to it.
Sure.
The decision to work with the pure molecule versus toad, and perhaps it was just for practical reasons, because it's easy to get 5-MeO in the pure molecule form in Canada, and it's probably a lot harder for toad. But are there other reasons for that? And did you personally? So here we're a little bit different issue. Sometimes I have been critical of some people on the toad side of things, where they have, I feel, really falsely claimed that only bufo secretions are magical and sacred and holy, and that if you're working with the pure molecule, that it's somehow less than, or it's not as good, or is not as transformative. And sometimes they even say, well, the toad has a spirit in it versus this other stuff is made in a lab, so it's worthless. And my response has always been, there's no part of reality that is more God than any other part of reality. And I don't believe in spirits personally myself. So I've been very critical of that perspective, and I'm curious, did any of that dynamic come into play for you in deciding to work with the pure molecule, or what would you want to share on that topic?
Yeah. So in the first years of doing this work, I worked with the secretion of the Sonoran Desert toad, and I did so because that's what presented itself in my life. I wasn't, I didn't have this ambition of like, I'm going to be a toad facilitator one day, and looked for it. It's kind of in a kind of cryptic way. It just found me, and I honor that. I trusted it. I trust that it came to me. I responded to it. I went through lots of different initiations and processes around like, am I just fooling myself? Like, what's going on here? And so that's what I served. Now, the pure molecule came into my life in a very similar way. It just kind of appeared. And in this sense, it was like somebody that thought about me, invited me into this weekend retreat, was using pure molecule. Okay, so that was my first experience with that. And then somebody later said, well, I have the pure molecule. Do you want some? It's kind of in this way of like, I wasn't looking for it. I just trusted it. And I learned along the way. I learned and I sifted through all of my own judgments about what's natural or unnatural or blah, 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 blah. I have an essay that I'll probably post here. It's called Essentially in Good Spirits. And basically my number one tagline for this topic is like, if there wasn't 5-MeO-DMT in that toad secretion, no one would be smoking it.
Right.
No one.
Yeah.
And so it is the essence of that. And that doesn't mean that there isn't a spirit. I don't know. I don't have an authority about those things, but I have chosen to use what is the essence of that in its isolated and therefore pure form. And when I say pure, it doesn't mean that the toad secretion is dirty or not clean because it's not pure. It's just that's not the only thing that you're taking into your body.
Right.
And so Jaguar or the pure molecule, that's the only thing that's going in their body. It's clean and clear in that way. I know what I'm putting in my body. I know what I'm offering others. And that's important to me. And so I work pretty much exclusively with the pure molecule now.
Yeah. So one of the things that working with the pure molecule offers that working with toad secretions does not is the potential for other routes of administration. So maybe now we can turn to this question and sort of preface it with, obviously there have been countless interviews and conversations here on this podcast about 5-MeO-DMT, and almost all of them have been on the subject of vaporizing or smoking toad and pure molecule. So it's all been about that sort of classic format of you take your hit and holy fuck, here we go, right? But when you're working with the pure molecule, and now even on the market, there are different varieties of the pure molecule. There's the freebase, which is good for vaporizing. There's the HCl, which can be good for insufflation. And then there's fumarate and there's succinate, and you can use these for making injections. So there's a whole different range of possibilities. And on that point that you made, that with the toad secretions, the only reason anybody uses toad is because it has 5-MeO-DMT in it. But there's a lot of other tryptamines, and some of them are more in the range of neurotoxins. So you would not want to be snorting them. You would not want to be injecting that. That is not a wise thing. they're not available that way. So by working with the pure molecule, we do have the opportunity for these other routes of administration. So we've only had one conversation here on the podcast about injections, and that's when the Church of Sacred Wellness came out here to Ashland, and they gave me my shot, and I had my ride, and it was awesome. But that's the only conversation we've had about it. So I'm interested to hear your perspective on what are the differences through these routes of administration in terms of how does it impact the experience? How does perhaps maybe some are more suitable for other kinds of clients or maybe for certain kinds of issues. You have a lot more experience here than I do. I've had one injection personally. I've done insufflation a couple different times. But that was just for my own sort of exploration. I never worked with anybody that way. Back when I was facilitating, it was 100% through inhalation. That was the only method that I ever used with folks. So yeah, anything you want to enlighten us on with these other routes of administration and how, especially with the injection, I know that that's something relatively new for you, I believe, and how you got into that or how you chose that. And
I started offering injection just last year. Late 23. It's only been a short while, but I definitely don't have as much experience with that as I do with inhalation. But I guess what I love about, what you're saying is like 5-MeO-DMT is incredibly versatile, right? There's so many ways that it can be brought into the body. And I would say that what gets overlooked is how versatile inhalation can be. Because oftentimes inhalation is kind of summed up in one experience. But of course, we can use the inhalation method in a wide variety of ways that are dependent on the delivery device, that are dependent on the intention. And I would say to some degree, the quality of how do I want to bring this in. This is kind of where I came up with the almost dichotomy of a surrender experience versus a submission experience, right? I can approach this with surrender in mind, and I can approach this with submission in mind. Both things are possible with inhalation. And I would say generally inhalation is associated with a submission experience. Something is overwhelming,
right?
An overwhelming something that I am submitting to I don't really have a choice. And that's not the only way that inhalation method can work. I rarely work with that, but sometimes I do. And so there's there's a wide range within inhalation alone. Now, with injection, there's less versatility of what you can do with an injection because once it's in, you're in.
Yeah.
Right. There's and because it's longer lived, there's only so much that you can do with it apart from interventions or therapeutic interventions or methodologies, depending on who's working with it. And so I would say that an injection experience really resembles what we might call a journey. Right, the psychedelic journey, in the sense that it's not 15 minutes long; it's much longer than that. It's it's not 6 hours long, but it's in this. It has an arc to it that is a lot more identifiable because of the length of time. And I would also say that, in my experience so far, a full release, if a practitioner is working with a full release as an intention, is kind of elusive with injection. It's not something that is, even if you're thinking of a submission experience, it's not super reliable as an ROA if we have a full release as an intentional experience that we want to have. And so I don't necessarily work with injection as an ROA when a full release is kind of like the goal, so to speak. And I don't necessarily have one is better than another, but I can say this, that I did a little survey. I actually was a part of a naturalistic scientific research looking at experiences with intramuscular injection. And all the members of that survey or that experiment, they were all clients of mine. And most of the clients, this is early on when I started working with injection. So almost everybody had not had an injection experience, but they all had been in my a client in my private practice. So they're accustomed to my methodology and my approach. And when asked what they preferred, or if they would, what would they go back to for their next session, injection or inhalation? More than half of them said that they would go back to inhalation, but it wasn't so much because they preferred the experience of inhalation, but it was that they preferred the session's methodology and how I held a session with inhalation, which is pretty much in a psycholytic approach. And the way that I use that term within a singular session is there's multiple rounds that are happening that are not set in stone, right? They're not predetermined, but they are responding to people's experiences. And that people feel really held in that. They also feel at choice, because in between the rounds, there's an element where they can inform our collective or our co-decision making, inform that with like what they feel is right for them in that moment.
Right.
And so, at least in my experience, most of my clients prefer to come back to the inhalation ROA.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. Yeah, but that opportunity to make decisions in between rounds. Do I want to go deeper this time? Do I want to go lighter? Do I need a little top off? And then getting that possibility for feedback. I mean, you mentioned sort of the emergent properties of the experience. And as we go up the scale of dose, we get more and more emergent properties that are elicited by the experience and by the medicine. And so then by observing what's happening and then getting feedback or coaching or addressing and then determining where we're going from here. I can see that there's a lot of that sort of give and take and that feeling that, especially if we are looking at it as a therapeutic process, that it gives us more milestones that we're kind of marking throughout the course versus, as you say, with the injection, well, you've got your 70-minute experience or whatever it is, but it's not really open to, okay, now I've come back down and now am I going to go again or what am I going to do? So then with those are probably the biggest extremes, the vaporization versus the inhalation. So then where does the insufflation, how does that within this spectrum and also within people's desires or requests, like how many people like to do that? And do you ever yourself recommend, like based on your interview with someone, do you feel like, well, I think maybe the injection would really be good for you or maybe the insufflation? So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Like I said, I seldom work with insufflation. It usually comes as a request. It's not something that I recommend, or it's not that I don't recommend it. This has nothing to do with that, but I don't lead with it. But if somebody, say, an existing client wants to try a different ROA and they request working with insufflation, okay, let's do that. Here's what you can anticipate in terms of the flow of the session. The session will change by the nature of the ROA. So with insufflation or injection, it's kind of like how I describe it versus my sessions with inhalation, is that inhalation, because there are different rounds and we kind of pause in between the rounds, right? It's not just some rapid succession. It's more like there's a round and then we get to take stock of that. To see what is the emergent material and kind of capture it, bookmark it for later. We don't have to dwell on it, right? But then it's going to continue on. And so it's kind of like a step. And I'm making, for those listening, they're not seeing my steps, but I'm
creating motions with his hands.
My hands are doing stuff. There's these steps where it goes up and it flattens, it goes up, and then it flattens and goes up again. It's a flight of stairs. Now with insufflation and injection, it's an escalator. Right? Once you've stepped on, now you're on. It's going. There is no pausing and capturing in some sort of in a kind of interpersonal way. And so I allow people to just be on that escalator. And as we know, trying to go back down once you're on an escalator doesn't really work very well. And so there's this escalator that you're just on. And so I'm less in an intervention mode, or I'm less in a there's less of an interpersonal or intersubjective field during the bulk of the timeline or the arc of those journeys with insufflation or injection. So it changes my sessions a lot, actually. And I would say that the greatest value that people get out of injection and insufflation is usually on the post peak. So what I personally enjoy and what I see as being really valuable for clients is the continual or the elongated opportunity to practice the letting go, to practice the surrender. Because in inhalation, we're accustomed to the peak, and then, okay, and, it's shortly over. And with insufflation and especially injection, there is a peak. Obviously, it has to, stop peaking at some point in time. And then there's usually either a plateau or a very slow decline where one who's accustomed to inhalation might be like, oh, okay, we're done. And my part in that is like, well, not yet.
Not yet.
Uh-huh. And so can you follow the breadcrumbs back to where you just were? Because yes, you just put a substance in your body, but really this mechanism, this capacity to let go, to surrender, to dissolve, to allow the revelation of that which we can't name to come forth is really you. And it's something that we can practice. It's like we're, like what's his name said, we're exercising the muscles of surrender. And there's such a long opportunity for that to happen on the post peak that's where I put a lot of emphasis when I'm working with that ROA.
Yeah, well, I really appreciate that you do that, because that's been one of my suggestions or critiques out there in 5-MeO culture, where mostly people are doing it through the vaporization and through the inhalation. And it's understandable. There's a tendency for, after people get through the peak and the ego reappears, that a lot of people just immediately start operating from the ego. And sometimes it's like, thank God I made it, or like, hooray, I made it, or I'm back. And people want to reach out and they want to start talking and want to start interacting. And I've always said, I've always called that the backside, where I've said, look, on the backside, if you do nothing during the backside, you can surrender and you can go back in multiple times, and then you'll catch as the ego suddenly comes back and you're like, wait, no, I'm in the room. And then you surrender and then you go back. But it's rather brief. And yes, with the injection, that is multiplied like 3-4 fold.
Right.
To that opportunity where it is a choice, even when it's through vaporization and there is that sense of submission, it still is a choice, because I'm sure you've seen people fight with it all the way through. So there's a choice in there somewhere, but it presents so powerfully that most people don't realize that they actually are making a choice to submit themselves to that and surrender and just to allow. But it's on that backside where it's not that insistence, because it's not rising up. It's not overwhelming. It's washing out, where people don't realize I can practice, as you say, those submission muscles. I can practice the surrender during this time period. And it's just something that I think a lot of people miss. And it's probably, well, it's definitely one of the most valuable aspects of the experience, because that's what we can then consciously walk away with. Like, am I getting all uptight now, or can I surrender?
Yeah.
Am I resisting right now, or can I surrender?
Right.
Am I avoiding right now, or can I surrender and be present? And so that's where we develop the more practical skills.
Totally. I totally agree with that. And so I see that as, I see surrender as a practice, right? How can I, just like you said, how can I decontract when I notice that there's contraction in my being, maybe literally in my physiology, but maybe just in a kind of crunchy, energetic contraction? How can I release that? How can I soften? How can I open? And we get better at that. And it takes time.
Yeah.
A lot of people come into sessions, and I would say this, especially with something like with inhalation and especially with a submission approach where there's kind of like, we're going all in all at once. It's almost like there's this test. I'm testing myself, or this lamenting after of like, oh, I just didn't surrender enough, or I didn't do well. And it's like, surrender isn't something you do. It happens.
Yeah.
We use it maybe as a verb, but somehow it's not something you do. And that's the irony in that term, exercising the surrender muscles. It's not a doing, it's the absence of doing, actually.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so paradoxical because the more you try and do nothing, you're still trying, you're still doing, aren't you?
Yeah.
You're really trying to surrender. So
yes.
it's hard. It's hard to figure out, like, how do I really fucking just do nothing? And that's where that backside, it's going to give you lots of opportunities if you pay attention to it. You're going to have lots of opportunities to practice. Oh, there's me thinking, there's me acting, there's me doing, there's me wanting, there's me grasping, versus, oh, nothing. And then there's that opening and that expansion again, and then the contraction comes back. And there again is where I think the emphasis on therapy actually is really valuable, because if we're just looking at what was your experience, was it good, was it bad, was it beautiful, was it blissful, or what, we miss the opportunity perhaps to focus on how can I learn to work with this in a way that is transformative and that I can practice and land in my being, and not just, okay, I'm shot out of the cosmic cannon and I made it. Woo! I mean, that's great. But it's the learning is where we grow. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. And I would add as well that there's this opportunity to take a state experience, and translate that, or allow it to perhaps potentially catalyze a shift in the structure of our consciousness. Right, the how we are operating on a day to day, and a state experience isn't going to do that alone. There's a difference there, but it has the potential. Those awakening experiences, this direct experience of pure awareness, pure presence, pure consciousness, has the potential to create those shifts through those periods of, if I borrow the language of Ken Wilber, for example, like you're going to wake up with an awakening experience, and then there's the cleaning up, and then there's the showing up. Like there's all these things that if you really want to affect meaningful change in your life, the state experience alone ain't going to do that. It will be an accelerator. It will be a catalyst. It will be an initiation, I hope. And there's more. How are we going to actualize what has been realized?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think we could just keep on going, because there's so much that we can talk about here, but I know that coming up in a little bit, we still have a little while, but I know that you're going to have to go. So I do want to shift gears now to talk about what actually brought us together here today. Was you reaching out with some information about how you were interested in starting a GoFundMe campaign, because you're interested in more directly sharing the results and what you have learned from your practice. And as you mentioned earlier in the podcast, maybe it'll be a book, maybe it'll be a presentation, maybe it'll be all of those things. But let's get into that now. And I'm really interested in kind of diving into what are the materials that you're working with at this point, And how are you going to be sorting through it? And what do we feel, or what do you feel? I shouldn't say we. What do you feel is going to be the outcome? Of course, knowing that you haven't started the project yet, so we can't predict the outcome. But because in other words, we've got people here that are listening that maybe they're going to want to support you on that. So what are they going to be supporting?
Beautiful. Yeah. Thanks for setting that up. I didn't anticipate that. I anticipated talking about this project that I'm in now. But yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. Well, now people come to me as they do you, with a lot of questions, and they want support. And even within our community of practice in the field of five, what there's not a lot of hard data to create answers from. It's just a lot of experience, and you have a lot of experience. And I guess now I'm in my 10th year of doing this full time. This is my vocation. This is what I do, and I have some experience, and I share it. And up until this point, I've been sharing that mostly through mentorship with other practitioners. But I feel like there's probably more that we can learn, not just as practitioners or researchers, but there's just more that we can potentially just learn about consciousness and how direct experiences can impact our lives. Because, like, why am I doing this? I want to be surrounded by those who have taken these experiences and been living with those kind of coveted qualities that anybody would aspire to: compassion and love and forgiveness and kindness. And yeah, that's the world I want to live in. So, okay, how can these experiences, how do these experiences have an impact on our lives, and therefore the lives that we share in society and our neighborhoods and our networks and the whole world? What are the conditions? What is an optimal setup for people having a meaningful, ongoing impact from these experiences? Is a full release, does it have a different impact on people's lives than those who are having experiences that, but they don't have a full release? Does that make a difference? Is a psycholytic approach, or the approach in the therapy context, does it have any benefit or advantage to the submission approach in the Sonoran Desert? Right? What are some of these factors that play a part into the change and transformation that we want for ourselves and we want in our lives? So I started kind of like at the beginning of our call, I was saying that over time I've developed this therapy-assisted 5-MeO-DMT experience practice in ceremonies, and I started to document the sessions once there was a consistent format and framework. So it started in 2020, where I started taking notes like a good therapist trained in the school might do, or whatever. Yeah. And so I have my observations and interpretations and everything from dosing sequences. So a lot of qualitative data, notes on conversations that I have with people before their experience, after their experience, conversations I have with people when they're on their 12th session, which is very different than when somebody's on their second session.
Absolutely.
And so I've decided to zero in on a quantifiable amount of data, right? People's experiences. So from 2020 to 2024, I have over 500 documented sessions with about 320 individuals that I plan to kind of take, like, what are the insights from all of these experiences that have been held in more or less a consistent manner, right? I have a format. Like I said, it's not a templated protocol, but it is a familiar set and setting. that people come back to over time. And so that's a healthy amount of data. And when I talk with people in academia and whatnot, they kind of like drool a little bit like, whoa,
Yeah.
that's a lot of data you're working with there. That's a big sample size. And I guess that's what I have to offer is experience. But there's a way that I can draw kind of some harder data from those experiences rather than just like, yeah, in my years I did this. I want to take something palpable and concrete so as to offer that into the field of five, the community of practice. I suspect it will support the greater knowledge, just as the prolificness that you are, Martin, and your publications and your sharing, right? It contributes to the understanding of what's going on here. And I'm going to be doing that with this book that comes out or what have you. Now, doing that, it's kind of a research project, right?
Yeah.
Rather than just me kind of, reminiscing of experiences in the past. It's more like, oh, how do I get this data collected? How do I frame and shape it? What exactly am I looking for? And so all this takes a lot of manpower. I'll be leveraging AI for sure, but at the same time, it's a hefty quantity of things. I take a lot of notes, and so there's a lot of information to sift through,
Yeah.
and so that will have some hard costs. And because I don't work in the academic field, I have decided to open that up to the whole community of practice to support me. I don't have a funding platform. I'm not getting a fellowship. There's no grants for this unregulated,
Yeah.
below ground practitioner. So I'm asking for support um, to make this a possibility. I think it'll have a lot of value when it comes out.
Yeah. So let's talk about your notes. You've mentioned taking a lot of notes. Are you actively taking notes during sessions and like making observations? Are you writing down like dosages and duration? Do you have a clock? Are you taking like times or you're like, what is the data that you've been collecting over these years?
Definitely dosing, like quantity, dosing sequences, some observations of like, outstanding or notable things that are happening within. So most of that note taking is so that when I follow up with people, I can remember. Like I
Yeah.
have a high quantity practice, right? I see a lot of people. So it helps me to remember when I take those notes so that when I'm speaking of like, oh, in round two, when this happened, this seemed to have this type of effect. Let's go with that. So some observations with every round, especially when I'm working with inhalation, because there are rounds, and then a summary. So after the client leaves, then and I'm not much of a typist, so everything is voice to text. Which also complicates, the extraction of information because it's just kind of ad lib.
Yeah.
Uh, and I'm summarizing what was there from the first round to the last round, what some of the takeaways were, recommendations that I have in mind for things that this client could follow up with, different directions, all of that prior to the call. And then I have notes on the calls themselves. So it's a lot of qualitative data, a lot of
Yeah.
text to sift through.
Yeah. And just from a different perspective, I would say like taking notes like that around your clients is very, very useful, not only for the dissemination of deeper understanding of 5-MeO and its impacts and effects for the wider world, but that's also really relevant information for the clients themselves, that this is the kind of thing when I'm doing an integration call with somebody, I love it when they tell me, well, my facilitator took notes and here's what they shared with me. So, at 7 p.m. we took 12 milligrams. They said that I
Mm-hmm.
was writhing about, and then later I was moaning, and then I smiled and laughed. And
Yeah.
because these are a lot of things that people in the moment, they're just like, oh, well, what was that? Right.
Yes.
And so getting this kind of information from a facilitator can be so useful for someone who
Yes.
I think you didn't use these exact phrases, but you said something very similar, that a big part of conversations post 5-MeO is helping people understand what happened, like what emerged, like what went on, and then what's happening now, and then what do I do with it? What do I, where do I go from here? How do I integrate this? And so having that level of information and data is just really, really invaluable. And so I would encourage everybody who facilitates to like do some form of that for your clients. I think it's very useful. And then if we can extract any kind of statistics or tendencies or probabilities or just any generalities from that, because I think that idea of working with data, we all have our anecdotal reports. We all have our anecdotal stories, but actually looking at some of the data, like one of the things, one of the facilitators that you and I both know, that we can't say his name, he was a little bit surprised when people from his temple filled out a survey with Johns Hopkins, and it turned out that something like 70 to 80% of the respondents said that they were having reactivations, and that they considered them to be a very positive aspect of their experience. He didn't know that. So when he saw the data, he was like, wow, I had no idea the numbers were that high. And so this is where, even someone who's doing this every day might not be aware of some of the trends within the data. And it's only by unpacking and exploring that data that we give it the opportunity to jump out and really inform us.
Totally. So let me ask you this, I'm just kind of creating the scaffolding for this project. And as I do that, as I amass and put together the data, I'm going to be, looking at it through different lenses. And, my question for you might be, given, this solid batch sample size, as a researcher might call it, what do you think would be valuable to know? Like, what would be a question that you would have that you think that would be a positive or meaningful contribution to the field that we share and that we're in?
Oh man, that's a lot of things. I think that one of the first things that comes to mind is if we're strictly dealing with full release doses, how many people feel that they successfully had a full release experience? How many people felt that there was some form of resistance or withholding that occurred? And then we can even ask the question, how many sessions at a full release dose did it take, or how many rounds did it take before you feel that you successfully crossed that threshold? I think that would be super fascinating. And then a whole different set of questions for people at the sub full release threshold would be like, because this is an interesting question within the realm of 5-MeO. There's a lot of mixed responses from people who have lower doses. Some people find them incredibly uncomfortable and confusing and don't like them, and are much happy just give me the full thing. And then other people, they love it. So I'd love to see what are the percentages, and is there any correlation with are people who are more likely to meditate or practice yoga, are they enjoying the low doses more than people who don't have that background? Something like that. And then especially when we're getting into full release doses, I'd be very interested in how many instances do we have of spontaneous bilateral symmetry in the body? How many instances do we have of not personally directed or spontaneous movements? What kind of movements? How do they take place? What kinds and what levels of emotional expression are happening? How many people are wailing? How many people are screaming? How many people are crying? And then, because often when people go through those and then they say like, I didn't even know I could scream that loud, or, and then that's the next question, like, how many people were aware of what their body was doing? How many people were aware of what sounds they were making? How many people were surprised by what occurred? I would be interested in were there any instances of glossolalia, of Babel energy language? Did anyone report that they were trying to say something in English or perhaps French, but couldn't get it out? So it came out, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Man, how many people experienced different kinds of vibrations in the body? And were they on the way up? Were they on the way down? Was it all the way through? Really, there's just so many somatic questions I'd be very interested in. And then for people who, quote unquote, had a full release dose, how many people said it was a void and it was empty? How many people said it was full of every possibility of every possible thing in all possible places and times? How many people said it had no emotional tone? How many people said it was blissful or ecstatic? How many people would describe it as forgiving or as having unconditional love? How many people would describe it as at not the egoic level, but be able to say that I identified with the experience, that was me at the deepest level, right? So then we're getting into like the non-dual question. If people are reporting any kind of imagery, what kinds of imagery and can we make any correlations? And I do think that overall imagery tends to be a bit more common with Bufo than it does with a pure molecule. But for example, sometimes I'm doing integration calls with people and they tell me, yeah, well, on the left side, that was hell. And on the right side, that was heaven. And I had to decide which one I wanted to go into. And I could see all the demons in the hell realm and I could see all the angels over there in the heavenly realm. So I'm interested in like, what would be the appearance of that? And then, getting into post-session like reactivations. How many people report reactivations? How many people report them as they're falling asleep? How many people report them at 3 a.m. in the morning? How many people report them when they're meditating? How many people report them when they're dancing or when they're making love? Then how many people experience them as positive or negative? How long did they last? My anecdotal reporting has always been like, well, reactivations tend to last around 2 weeks. That's just on average, but it's based on anecdotal reporting. So like getting some hard data. How many people, were there any people in the sample size that said, I wish I had never done this. Oh my God. Versus how many people said, thank God I did this. Or this happened just in time. And then especially looking at the people who are doing, multiple sessions with you over time, looking at what factors are changing. Like you mentioned, and this is something that I totally agree with, somebody's second session with 5-MeO is going to be so different than their 12th session.
Oh, yeah.
Like just worlds apart. Different. And so do we see any trajectories there? Do we see any commonalities? What aspects, what is changing for people? So again, in my anecdotal reporting, I would say earlier sessions tend to be more dramatic and more explosive. The more you work, the more it's about fine tuning and centering and just being present with it.
Yeah.
But that's anecdotal. I don't have hard data to back any of that up. So I think that the variety of questions we could ask, I think, are endless. And I would also think, maybe you've contemplated this, that it might require creating some questions and surveys that then you'd be sending back out to your
that's going to be going to be a part of the cost and why I've created a fundraiser, is because developing a questionnaire that's going to be effective at getting this is going to take some, it's a lot of thinking. By the time somebody's maybe listening to this podcast, maybe a bulk of it has already been done. I don't know, but there's a lot going into this. And I'm going to take, the questions that you just shared as like, oh yeah, these are great questions. I want to know that too. Who, as other facilitators, who wouldn't want to know these things, right?
Yeah.
This is valuable information. And I think that the bulk of what I have as data can provide a decent amount of answers to that. Not that it's an authoritative set of answers that are there, but it's a contribution. It's an addition to. And I think that there's a consistency that is relatively reliable. Maybe it's not to the rigor of academia. I don't know. But it's exciting. I think that there's a lot to learn here. And I might even pick your brain again about what should I be asking, Martin? Because you just had a huge list there, and I'm going to be taking note of that.
All right, my brain is ripe for the picking. So I know that you've got to jump
I
really
do.
shortly here. So I will be posting this interview soon. So hopefully the GoFundMe will still be up at that time. But if people want to support that, where do they need to go and where can they find you?
Well, as you mentioned before, my website is chadcharles.net, and you can reach out to me there. I don't have the GoFundMe page on the website. Maybe that's something I should do. The link to it will be wherever somebody listened to this podcast. Obviously, it's a GoFundMe page. It has a goal, and I'm going to be reporting on that page as the months go by as to what I am applying the funds to, and what is I'm basically, there's going to be things that I'm not thinking about right now that will come into the forefront, and I'll be like, oh, right, and this needs to happen, and this will have a hard cost, and reporting along the way. Got the questionnaire filled out, got all the data extracted, got audio transcripts transcribed with an AI thing or what have you, and just kind of feed that information along the way so that people who decide to donate understand where this is going and what the process is.
Awesome. Well, it's been great to check in with you today, Chad. I'm really excited about this project, so I want to hype it up here. And let's not let another 5 or 6 years, however long it's been, go.
Yeah.
But we'll have you back when actually all this is done. We'll have you back on, and we're going to talk about all the results and all the data. Okay?
That'd be great. Yeah.
All right, man.
Thanks a lot for this, Martin.
Yeah.
Good to see you.
So good to see you today.